Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is your boy Jay Mays, aka Jarrell Mason. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Album Cover, where we get inside the entertainment industry with those in the know and give them their flowers while they're here to be celebrated. With me right now, I have two bad brothers that know any and everything about music, especially when it comes to that sound from that great state known as Minnesota, Minneapolis, to be exact. And you can catch it on their podcast, The Electric Vibe, with various acts people associated in and around the Minneapolis Sound. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big round of applause and thank you for coming on to the podcast. Kurt and Jay, fellas, welcome to Beyond the Album Cover.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Appreciate you, man. Thanks for having us on, Jarrell.
Man, no problem. It's definitely been a pleasure. Been wanting to get you guys on for a minute. I like the content that you guys have been putting out, especially the interviews you've been cranking out with, like I stated earlier at the top, people in and around the Minneapolis Sound. So let's jump right into it. Before your love of the Minneapolis Sound occurred, were there any other musical influences that you all were listening to before you guys latched on to what became known and loved around the world as the Minneapolis Sound?
Kurt,
Hey,
I'm
you
gonna
want to take that first?
well, I was actually gonna be a gentleman and let you go because beauty before age.
Well, I tell you, Jarrell, I was a suburban white teenager in the 1980s, and um, when I grew up as a kid in the 70s, I grew up in the era of 8-track cassettes and vinyl records, which now, of course, has made a huge comeback. I was influenced just about everything. My first musical memories are having Hall and Oates and the Eagles on 8-track. Um, Chuck Berry's My Ding-a-Ling on 8-track. Yeah, I know. 26 dumb ditties off K-Tel Records on 8-track. So I had a whole host of classical music. My mom, when we were kids, exposed us to a lot of different music. When I was a teenager, I'd say the first band, I was into heavy metal along with a lot of my other friends. So I go from purple music to heavy metal. So one of the bands, and I still listen to and got to meet the lead singer of recently on my 54th birthday, was Judas Priest. So I run the gamut. I'm a classically trained opera singer. At one point in my life, I sang opera. So you know, ADHD is a wonderful thing. I always tell people that ADHD brought me to so many different musical avenues in my life that I embrace just about any of it.
And I can actually echo that, Kurt, because I kind of came from the same type of background. I was exposed to different types of music growing up. So, my father was heavily into Sinatra, Tony Bennett, a lot of the big band stuff. And then, Stan Getz and, Glenn Miller and some of those stalwarts. But at the same time, my parents listened to a lot of Doobie Brothers, and some of the bigger acts of the 70s. So I really had that whole exposure to different types of music, so-called white music, so-called black music. My older brothers, I'm the youngest of three, were into a lot of classic rock, Led Zeppelin and Rush, older Rush. So, I was exposed to it all. It didn't matter what color the band was. Was the music good? Yes, I gravitated towards heavy metal. I've seen, almost every heavy metal band back in the 80s, from Bon Jovi to Poison to White Snake to Kicks, Faster Pussycat. But then I liked a lot of pop music as well. Some of the earlier groups like Wham, and I was really big into the 80s kind of new wave glam bands. And then obviously, Prince had been on the scene for a few years. I didn't really get into Prince until about 1982 when I first saw the Little Red Corvette video, and then it kind of was off
Yep.
to the races. So it's been just a mishmash of all different styles and types of music that I still listen to this day.
Right. So Jay, you mentioned that you came in to Princeton with Little Red Corvette off of the 1999 album, and it was interesting for me. I discovered Prince from Parade Under the Cherry Moon forward because with me being born in 85, a year after Purple Rain, and seeing how he immediately scrapped Purple Rain did the next album, disbanded the Revolution because he wanted to keep the creative juices flowing and not get stuck in that lag of playing the hits, because with him being musically astute, that he would find that bored and repetitive playing the same songs over and over each night, which was why the European Purple Rain tour never happened. He just did the US tour and then went to the studio to record, I believe it was the Around the World in a Day album with Raspberry Beret.
Right.
While he was on tour with the Purple Rain album,
Right.
so he's recording most of that stuff in a mobile truck. Susan Rogers would get a call at like 2 or 3 in the morning. I mean, this would be after the guy did a 2 or 3 hour show. I mean, just the work ethic just blows my mind.
And if I remember correctly, on Christmas Eve, while he was on the Purple Rain tour, after the Christmas Eve show, he did recording that evening. I think it was just him and Susan Rogers, I believe. And, it was just all about the work. So that work ethic was amazing.
Yeah, because I've listened to the Red Bull Music Academy interview that she did along with Jim and Lewis, and they all spoke about how Prince was one of those artists that eat, sleep, and breathed it. It was like, don't have nothing planned because you'll get that call.
Right.
What you doing? I'm sleep. I want to write. I'm sleep. I want to write. Come down to the studio. Click.
Right. It really wasn't a request.
It was a demand.
Right. And having said that, I would encourage anyone who wants to get a sense of that work ethic or get a sense of how Prince recorded, read Dwayne Tudall's on Prince and the studio sessions. I mean, it's fascinating, to book a studio from, sometimes open until lockout, until all night, and the studio's locked out the whole time just for him. And the way he recorded, the times he recorded, the marathon 16, 18, 24 plus hour sessions, particularly after he had his own studio at Paisley Park, really gives you an insight into how he worked and the way that he worked. But more interestingly, it's just the detail with which he recorded and played and mixed. It was just unbelievable.
Yeah, so speaking of the work ethic and attention to detail, being in the band, I know for some former members of Revolution, and of course, but the time being, Prince associated, how it was almost boot camp where you're expected to do any and everything, because Jan was talking about, I guess they were running through 777 and Prince was, I guess, catching, he said, why aren't you doing this? Well, I can only do this. No, do this. And you just stack. And his goal was always make it bigger than the record. And the crazy thing when you think of, the time, Vanity 6, Apollonia 6, how he had enough creative juice flowing to where I can put all these other acts together and pretty much have everybody under the illusion that they're different acts, but you really are feeling me. And if you look at the movie Idolmaker, that was the inspiration for Prince for creating The Time.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Right. Somebody's done their homework.
Right. and it's funny, Jarrell, make that kind of the story, about how, Brown Mark had said during rehearsals, he could get to the part where he could, be playing a groove, go over to the kitchen, make a sandwich, whack in one hand, make the sandwich, eat the sandwich, come back, and never miss a beat. And so, I had heard stories, of lore and what rehearsals and things were like. And I was talking to Monty Moyer from The Time backstage after a gig once. And he looked me dead in my face and he goes, yeah, that's true. He goes, Prince wanted you stepping, he wanted you dancing, he wanted you singing, he wanted you playing, he wanted you doing everything at the same time. He goes, it really, really was that intense. And it's different when you hear it, face to face from somebody who was there. Not that I ever doubted that that's what happened, but you get a better appreciation for it for somebody who had gone through it.
Right.
It's that old school vaudeville ethic. You had to be able to sing, dance, entertain, and do all those things. That's an old school work ethic that's, and I'm sure his father, who was closer to that generation, had that in him as well. You had to entertain in a holistic way. You had to be able to do all that stuff and dress well,
right,
and look good, I mean,
Mhm.
it was not just the audio, it was the visual representation of everything.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, it kind of brought to mind with Prince always wanting to play the part, even when you're not in show, when you're out in the public. Brought me to the
Yeah.
mind of the old days of wrestling where you wouldn't break kayfabe, where you would always be the character in and around 24/7. Like for me, as a wrestling fan, it still feels weird to see and hear Undertaker speak out of character. He came up under that old
Yep.
school mentality of you always want to keep the illusion, be the character even when you're not in the ring. And Prince followed that ethos to the T, whether he would be in concert or out of concert.
Absolutely.
I've spoken to Neil Carlin directly about that, who writes a lot about that in his book, this thing called life. And getting to have coffee with him one on one in 2022, um, it's very much it's very much a cloak of invincibility. He never wanted to seem vulnerable at any time. He always wanted to have this shield, if you will,
Right.
Mhm.
of invincibility.
Right. And with that shield of invincibility, there we go. That, everybody, of course, talked about, Michael and Prince and how
Mhm.
it was a big media generated rivalry between the two. But when you look at it in hindsight, both two totally different artists. Michael was more of the
Completely.
people's choice, where he was all about the hits, the people, the dance, the visuals with the videos, and being well known, well loved. While Prince was very artistic. He didn't care if his records became commercial or not. He was going to put it out regardless. And do you think, from afar, that he was kind of seeing what Michael was doing and was saying, okay, he's got his thing going, but I'm gonna stick to what I do and not do what he does because we're two totally different people.
But at the
I
same time, they both shared one major influence, which neither one of them would exist without, and that is James Brown.
James Brown. Absolutely.
And both of them, you look at the dance moves, particularly Michael. He could copy every dance lick that James Brown ever did on a stage. Prince was no different. All the splits and stuff like that. I mean, they both definitely had the same influences, uh, in their life.
Right. And they were both aware of each other, and what the other
Oh,
was doing.
sure.
But I think that, Jarrell, to your point, Prince wasn't so much, especially in the later years, about making hits. I think one of the things that really attracted me to the Prince vibe and the persona was that he was going to do what he was going to do. From the time, that he said, I'm going to produce my first album, and I'm not going to have an outside producer do it. Okay. And you figure he's
Yep.
20 years old at the time, in 1978 when For You came out. And he said, no, I'll play everything and I'll produce it myself. And there's been a record in his entire catalog and his entire history of him just doing exactly that, what he felt was right. And, sometimes it was, damn what the masses say. Okay. I mean, think about it. Think about after Purple Rain, what a juggernaut that was. And then to
Yeah.
put out an album like Around the World in a Day, less than a year later, that was totally left of center of what Purple Rain was,
Completely.
right? And just to make it, it was daring. It was different because nobody was doing it at the time. And he stayed true to himself all those years.
Yeah.
He didn't
And
want to be copyable. He didn't want to copy himself. I mean, when others went left, when trends were going left, particularly by the time you get to Diamonds and Pearls, and
Mhm.
everybody's using drum machines and hip hop sampling, and he used a little bit of that, quite a bit. But when people were using drum machines, he had a live drummer.
Right.
He didn't completely get rid of the drum machines, but he definitely had a more live feel in Diamonds and Pearls, where everybody else was going with samples and drum machines. So when people went left, he went right
yeah, and you
to
brought up.
stand out.
Go ahead, Jay.
And it wasn't an act, it wasn't fake. I mean, it was who he was, it was genuine. And if you went along for that ride, cool. And if you didn't, well, that's cool too.
Right. And you mentioned that the common influence of both Prince and Michael was James Brown. Also felt Prince was influenced by Sly Stone, of course, of Sly and the
Yeah, sure.
Family Stone. And then also, I think another person that gets lost in the mix when we talk about Prince and kind of like that early hybrid sound between funk and rock. You probably know what I'm talking about. A lot of people don't know that Strawberry Letter 23 was not originally done by Brothers Johnson. It was originally done by Shuggy Otis. And I think
Sure.
Shuggy probably had some influence indirectly or directly on Prince, to me.
Sure.
And I would agree. And let's face it, Prince had a lot of influences that he didn't mention, right? And because let's face it, he said less than he said less things than he'd said in interviews and things like that. So there were certain things he wasn't going to tell, but the influences all around, I think, were very, very telling.
Mm-hmm. And then when you go ahead, Kurt, did you have something you want to say?
Yeah, sure. Oh gosh, tons to say. So the way that he configured his bands with both black and white members, like Sly did with the Family Stone band, and then later incorporating actual brass members into his band, which Sly already had you know in his configurations of his band. But then you think about Fleetwood Mac. You bring up Shuggy Otis, and the brothers Johnson, and then when I think of Michael, since we're talking about Michael as well, um, that whole lineup of people that were involved, because that whole up to Light Up the Night for the brothers Johnson, that was all Quincy Jones and his associates. Okay. Rod Temperton, who wrote Thriller for Michael and a bunch of songs on Off the Wall and stuff like that, he would borrow all that personnel, including the brothers Johnson, to record on the Thriller album, Off the Wall, certainly. So, you know, yeah, it's a great connect the dots universe when you think about and I'm glad you mentioned Strawberry Letter Number 23. That original version by Shuggy Otis is very, very Hendrix,
Mhm.
more Jimi Hendrix than what the brothers Johnson did with it, and certainly Hendrix was an influence in there as well. And
Right.
of course, Carlos Santana.
And then to think about in the beginning of Prince's career, you mentioned Jay how risky it was for a new artist to go into an established label and say, "I don't want no executive producer. I want to do everything." And it took Prince doing a showcase for the labels. I think primarily Warner Brothers, Mo Osteen, and some of the big wigs were in attendance, and they said, "Mm-mm. Sorry, Maurice, stick with EWF. This boy can do it all."
Right, right. And that's a testament because I mean, think about being that young and basically a precursor to what was going to happen years later when he was fighting for his masters was going up against the record company and saying, I'm not going to be a black artist. I'm not going to be a white artist. I'm not going to be pigeonholed into a certain type of music, but I'm also not going to be dictated to as to how my career is going to go or how my recordings are going to go. So, 20 years old, you're a kid, right? And to have the gumption to sit there and say, nope, that's not what I'm going to do, and then carry it on through almost every aspect of your life, sometimes to his detriment, to be honest.
Mm.
But to have that type of mentality, that's strong of a will, I think carried him through his entire career.
Yeah, and then we saw that trend with every artist to come after him since white, black in between, primarily Lenny Kravitz and Sanda Maitreya, formerly known as Terrence Trent D'Arby, who was a mix of both Prince and Michael. And if you have not listened to the classic 1987 album, The Hard Line, according to Terrence Trent D'Arby, one of the best albums you'll ever hear.
You better ask somebody if you haven't listened to it. I bought it when it came out, and I thought that so he's just a different kind of Prince. That was unfair, because if you listen to, yes, it's easy to go to say, wishing well, but if you listen to Sign My Name and you listen to Dance Little Sister, he's an individual. He's an individual who was finding his own niche. And when he came out with his second album, I think it was Neither Fish Nor
Not for
Fowl,
flesh. Yep.
right? And it
Neither
was
fish nor flesh. Yep.
right, and it was not a hit. It was such a deviation from the hard line, according to Terrence Trent D'Arby. But again, another trailblazer who did it his way.
Mhm.
Jay, let me piggyback on that, if I may, Jarrell.
Go ahead.
I had the honor and privilege of talking to the producer of that album, introducing the Hardline, and that is none other than Martin Ware, who was well known for his being a founding member of the Human League before "Don't You Want Me, Baby." and he split from that band. But he became a producer for many artists under the moniker British Electric Foundation. He got to work with Tina Turner um, on a track, a cover of the Temptations' "Ball of Confusion" for a project that he called "Songs of Quality and Distinction Volume One." And go listen to it if you haven't heard it. And he eventually worked with her on a couple tracks for Private Dancer album.
Wow.
And fast forward, that's how he got the gig, because a young guy working at Sony Records gave him these demos that Sananda Maitreya, aka artist formerly known as Terrence Trent D'Arby, was working on. And he heard this. He said, "Oh my Christ, this guy's a mix of Sam Cooke and Stevie Wonder." He said it sounded like outtakes. His demos sounded like outtakes of a Stevie Wonder album. I know exactly what to do with this kid. And when you listen to Wishing Well, the drum sound on that is something that Martin lifted basically from David Bowie's Let's Dance. So listen to the intro to Let's Dance of David Bowie and listen to the drum intro of that. That's what he was going for.
I can hear that in my head right now.
Martin's become a good friend, and just honored to talk to him about working with Sananda. Apparently, they're doing something right now that he can't discuss, so I don't know any more than that. But apparently, they might be doing something together as we speak. So
Yeah, I
I'll
know.
have to talk to Martin about that. But
Yeah, I know Sananda. He just did an interview on Questlove Supreme not too long ago. Two-parter, a rarity, because he rarely does interviews. So it was definitely good to hear him talk about his career and everything after the celebrity of Hardline and him finding his way to being Sananda Maitreya.
Well, neither fish nor flesh. I got a little insight on that. Apparently, he mixed that while he was tripping on acid. So if you listen to the mix of it, it's kind of muddy and all over the place. He was tripping big time.
Well, if a pitcher can pitch a no-no off LSD, then you could definitely mix the album with all the stuff.
There you go. Well, look, now Prince actually factors into Sananda because he contacted Martin and Terrence when he was still Terrence, and asked if he could hear the demos. He knew that Terrence was the competition at that time. You know, I mean, that album went on to sell 20 million copies or more back in the day, and I believe performed the same year that Prince was up for the Grammy of the Album of the Year award along with U2,
right?
For their album.
Yep.
Oh man.
Yeah, but he asked for the demos, and they're like, no.
Right.
No, you
Prince
can't hear it.
Get what he wants, right?
Right.
Prince knew what was up. I'm sure he admired him.
Yeah, he had ears to the ground, and somebody that had ears to the ground and to the stage in the beginning of his career. I don't know if you all saw the documentary Bitchin' about Rick James and how they told the story of how Prince was opening and Rick was doing any and everything to sabotage the show because he knew, he's coming.
Right.
Well, the stories that Dr. Fink, earlier pre Jay in the mix, got to talk to Dr. Fink about the Light It Up tour. And when Prince and not even the Revolution at that time, when Prince's band, when Matt Fink was in there, I mean, they basically the band, the Rick James band, stole equipment to record for one of their albums. I don't remember which album it was, but I mean, they punked Prince big time. There was definitely a rivalry. Make no mistake.
And deservedly so, because of what Prince was becoming. But I find it interesting what happened then with Prince, just not too much longer into his career, with The Time, because The Time became his biggest rival, a group that he had created, wrote all the songs, played all the instruments, albeit with Morris on vocals, but he created this juggernaut that in some cities was outperforming him on more attention than him on the 1999 tour. So they were dropped from a lot of cities. But it's interesting because what Rick James saw with this young upstart Prince then kind of came into Prince's realm when he created The Time.
And perfect segue, Jay, about The Time. I believe I heard that Get It Up was originally intended for Brick. And fun fact, Sleepy Brown's dad was in the band Brick, and originally Alexander O'Neal was to be the lead singer at the time, and I believe Jammin Lewis told a story about Alex came and say, "I need my paper."
Right.
And he was gladly shown the door, and Morris got elevated from drummer to front man.
Right. Right. And
at Perkins Restaurant, no less.
At the Perkins, is that it?
The Perkins. I've been to the Perkins. Yes.
Right. And it's interesting because, you know, those stories, you know, are well documented.
Yep.
And you know, I often think what would it have been like, you know, without Morris? You know, the time certainly wouldn't be what it is. I mean, because it has an imprint, you know, I mean, they're all world-class musicians, and I've been fortunate enough to meet all of them and to spend time with, you know, Jammin Lewis and Jesse, and, you know, and that's not a commercial for me. I don't mean it that way. It's just that here's guys who I looked at the album cover back in the day and said, wow, you know, back in 1981, 80, 81, said, wow, look at these cats, you know, this is cool. And then years later, actually being keeping company with them. But I never got the sense that they thought that they were bigger than they were. They were about their business, and they certainly had an image, and they certainly had a playfulness about them. But I can't imagine the time being the time without the members that are in it now. You know, so if Alexander was the lead singer, and let's say that Morris was the drummer, it would certainly be a different vibe than what it is now.
Yeah, I agree, because I felt Morris gave the time that pop look, pop voice that really set it off when MTV was just being beamed into homes. And let's face it, up until Michael and Prince, Black artists were rarely getting played on MTV. So they were one of the early door knockers to say, hey, you're going to play us, you're going to respect us. And of course, Rick James was tooting the horn earlier saying this is Back of the Bus plantation style.
Right. That part. And Rick was the pariah that got, I mean, he was kind of crucified for speaking out against that, and MTV's retaliation was not showing his videos on MTV and instead showing Michael Jackson's videos and Prince's videos. Yeah, so he became Rick James in effect became the sacrificial lamb for them.
Right. And I want to touch on, you know, with Jammin Lewis, of course, before they hooked up at the time, they were in various bands in and around Minneapolis. If you go listen to Numeral Group, they did a compilation album of all the pre-Minneapolis sound acts. There was an act called, I think, Mind Over Matter, I believe, was the name of the band. And of course, history, it's been well documented. Jammin Lewis is unceremoniously firing from the time led to them working full-time at Taboo Records. And with me being a North Carolina native, I gotta give props and respect to the late great from Climax, North Carolina, the late great Mr. Clarence Avant, and how an important role he played with Jammin Lewis, Alex, and Sherelle with all those records that came out of Taboo, and of course SOS Band.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, it's funny how things work out, especially with that type of history and that type of lineage, right? And Jarrell, to your point, you know, the Jammin Lewis being, you know, summarily fired, right? Let go from the time. Almost, I'm not going to say a blessing in disguise, but look what the end result was, right? But I don't know that it could have gone any other way, because with Prince's personality and with Prince's expectation, you know, from what I hear, you know, it was, I told you guys I didn't want you doing the producing thing. You ended up getting stuck in Atlanta with a freak snowstorm, right? In Atlanta. And they couldn't get back to a date on the Purple Rain, on the 1999 tour. And for that to happen, and yet then for their careers to turn into what they turned into, right? It's not a blessing in disguise, but it's certainly, everything happens for a reason, right? And so they ended up with this hugely successful career, worked with a lot of different artists, helped a lot of different artists, and Prince did his thing. But it's just very, very interesting sometimes how history works out.
I agree, because I kind of felt like, you knew Jammin Lewis had the talent, but I think with acts kind of like Prince, James Brown, they always want to have that center of control to be in the front. And if somebody were to get a little light, it may not sit well. That I do not know, you know, but I just kind of get that vibe of nobody's going to outshine me. You're going to be number two. the spotlight has to be on me. And then just thinking about how the Minneapolis sound pretty much influenced the whole country, especially the Midwest. You had acts like, of course, Ready for the World out of Flint, Dream Boy out of Oak Park, Michigan, The Deal out of Cincinnati. When you take a look at the album covers for Street Beat and Material Things, they were definitely following what Prince and the Revolution was doing.
Right.
And
And
I especially love the guys out of Dayton, Ohio. You know, let's think about Ohio players. Let's think about Zap.
yep,
I mean, even though they're not Minneapolis sound, they're definitely keeping an ear to the ground there too.
right, right. And you know, I'm always impressed by the influence, you know, the influence that Prince had, the influence of the Minneapolis sound. And, you know, I think it's unfair when people say, you know, sometimes, well, it's just copycat. Think about Jermaine Stewart. Okay. He had the huge hit, obviously, with We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off, right? You know, people said, oh, he's just a Prince copycat. Well, yes. Can I see the influence? Sure. Would I say it's a copycat altogether? I don't think so. I don't think that, you know, Oh Sheila, you know, was, I'll call it an homage to the Minneapolis sound. I don't necessarily think it was a copycat, but sometimes how can you can't help but be influenced by what's popular and what's out there, right? And sometimes the plate is big enough for everybody to eat off of.
Right.
Them Lynn drum beats sounded a whole lot like it though.
Well,
Those
I
Lynn drums, man.
wasn't gonna go there, but
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned Jermaine Stewart. Jermaine Stewart, former dancer on Soul Train.
Yeah.
Soul Train Records was the original record label before Don Cornelius got out of the business, and it reformed as Solar under Dick Griffin.
Yep.
I believe you guys had on the Electric Vibe, someone that was affiliated with Solar played on
Yes.
Dynasty, Bitches in the
Yep.
Land of Music, and I know that record because Camp Low sampled that for Lucchini, produced by North Carolina native Ski Beats.
yep.
Yep. So Ricky Freeze Smith, who is currently the bass player for the touring version of Morris Day in the Time, we were granted his first interview talking about his time, you know, playing outside of the whole that his days with Billy Preston, all the way through to working with you know, Dick Griffey and Leon Silvers, and he talked and primarily his first instrument was playing the drums, a lot like Morris Day, um, a lot like St. Paul Peterson, who was our recent guest as well. So Ricky also played the keyboards. He's on the Whispers, and the beat goes on. That's him playing the synth. That's him playing some of the synth licks on the Whispers. So he got to work not just on his own band he would be in Dynasty, but he got to work on the entire Solar Records group. Shalimar, which had you know, Jody Watley and um,
Howard Hewitt.
Howard Hewitt. So
Howard Hewitt.
yeah, he was. It was almost like Solar Records, you know, coming out of Soul Train Records was all like a updated version of Motown Records at that time. And he was kind of like the you know, one of the funk brothers that would play in Motown as a session musician. So he cut his teeth on quite a bit of stuff playing drums and keyboards. And then his third instrument is the bass, which now is what he's mainly known for.
Right.
Crazy.
Right. And what's even crazy, I hear he got some good barbecue sauce. Send some
Yeah.
my way, please. And
I
thank
haven't
you.
I haven't tried it yet.
Yeah, I need that barbecue sauce, Ricky. If you're listening, I need that sauce. Mild, because my spice tolerance is very low. Now, when we mentioned in Solar Records, and you mentioned Leon Silvers, and how before Janet hooked up with Jammin' Lewis for Control on the first two albums, the self-titled debut album and Dream Street, Leon
Yeah.
Silvers did work on that album along with Renee and Angela and a lot of other acts. And those weren't bad albums, but it lacked that personal touch that, of course, Jammin' Lewis became known for, where
Sure.
they treat it as if you're going to the tailor to get a suit custom made, and it's only designed to fit you. Then, of course, the story goes when Papa Joe Jackson first met with Jammin' Lewis, he told him, I hear you guys work with Prince. I don't want my daughter sounding like Prince. And they assured him she's not gonna sound like Prince. Now, was smart, number one, to get her out of Havenhurst and go to Minneapolis to record, to get out of Papa Joe and the Handler site, so they could really be free to record, experiment, observe, and for Jamie Lewis to do a character study on Janet to find out what sounds work for her, and just have everyday conversation, which later morphed into the songs that we know and love to this day.
And that's I love that analogy about Janet, because the first two albums are good, okay, and I'm certainly not going to call them pedestrian, but they sound like everyone else. If you think about it, if you listen to Control, you listen to Rhythm Nation, you get the Jam and Lewis stamp, but they're not Minneapolis Sound albums. Think about that. It is tailor-made for Janet. And that, I think, was what most impressed me, because Pleasure Principle, okay, written by our good
Monty Moore.
Okay, that doesn't. I mean, that song holds up to this day. That's fantastic. Black Cat, shout out to Jelly Bean Johnson, love you, Bean. Those are Janet songs. They hold up today. They're Janet songs produced by Jam and Lewis, right? And you know, the sphere of influence they had as the producers, but they're not Minneapolis Sound albums. So to their credit, they worked with Janet, had conversations with Janet that morphed into the songs, right, and made her indelibly her own. So I think that that's also a testament, because how easy would it be to just make it sound like Controversy, or make it sound like a Time album or 1999, right? But they're just totally different works, you know, in their own regard.
At the same time, we want to shout out the first two Janet records, because Ricky played on, I think, 4 or 5 tracks on the first Janet Jackson album, and then Jesse Johnson, right, played on the second album, Dream Street, or wrote 1 or 2 songs for that.
He wrote 1 or 2 songs on there. Shout out to Jesse.
So I mean, so there was even the Minneapolis players still were in that sphere of influence even before Jam and Lewis took over and really, you know, bolted her career up.
Right.
So.
Right. And speaking of Jesse Johnson, you know, came through Prince, Jesse Johnson's Review, and then Tamara and the Scene came in through the industry through Jesse. And of course, they had Everybody Dance, Affection, which was sampled by 5MC for All I Want off the Close to You album, produced by David Jam Hall and Corey Rooney. And of course, the Family spinoff act with Jerome, Jelly Bean, St. Paul, and it was it Susanna that was in the Family?
Yep.
Okay. Now I heard the demo of Screams of Passion that Prince did. I'm like, whoa. I wonder how many times Prince had like, maybe I should keep this for myself.
Keep that for myself.
Instead of giving it, because I didn't know until years later when I got the vinyl for the Family's album, thanks to my Aunt Peach's Uncle David's record collection that was collecting dust, that they originally did Nothing Compares to You, because I grew up hearing Sinead O'Connor's cover and how it became an international pop hit. And I was surprised that Prince even gave the okay for her to cover that, seeing how he keeps all his stuff close to the vest, and given how also at the same time he let Hammer sample When Doves Cry for Prey.
Right.
Yep. And charged him a pretty penny for that too.
Right. And he was notorious for not allowing samples, but in those instances, you know, her covering and Hammer sampling it, you know, was a testament. I want to talk just a little bit about the Family, because to Kurt's earlier point, you know, we had St. Paul Peterson on. He's a great friend.
Yes.
Of the show and of ours personally, dare I say, a friend of ours. And my favorite version still of Nothing Compares to You is St. Paul's. You know, I bought the Family Out cassette back in 1985 when it came out, and loved it. And not just because it was, you know, a Prince associated artist album, but because it's a good album, no matter who played on it. Paul's voice is great on it, but I am most familiar with St. Paul's version of Nothing Compares to You. So it's my favorite. I'll be honest with you, I'm not a fan of Sinead O'Connor's. I know that it was a hit and a lot of people liked it, but I just wasn't, there we go. I just wasn't a fan of it. And I liked when Prince covered it, saw him cover it even live a bunch of times, but still shout out to St. Paul, because you know, his version is the OG version.
and Jarrell, I hope that one of my favorite posthumous records that they put out, apart from Welcome to America for Prince, was that Originals album where you hear the demo versions of like Jungle Love and stuff like that. So maybe if they do a second Originals compilation, we get to hear that Screams of Passion demo because honestly, I haven't heard it. I
It's
haven't. I'm sure I
funky.
could go on YouTube and look it up, but
It is
uh,
funky.
It is funky. And then also, there is a demo version of Glamorous Life that's out,
yeah,
with
yeah,
Sheila E. And I never
yeah.
realized how big the timbales added to that record. It just provided that extra punch. And of course,
Right.
Sheila E. music star in her own right before coming into
Yep.
Princess or with the Escovedo family, her work with
Oh,
George Duke and
oh,
all of those funk acts coming out of the Bay Area and
absolutely.
just coming into that sphere with Glamorous Life, Holly Rock, and Sister Faith, Cuckoo, and just great
Yeah.
records. I know you're surprised I know this stuff. Hey,
Go ahead, Brother Preach.
I
No,
was
you're
paying
good.
attention while watching Video Soul when I was 3 years old, just graduating from diapers. But I want to go with Alex really quick. So 1985, Alexander O'Neal dropped his debut album. And then 87, to me, this is one of the best sequence albums I've ever heard of all time. Hearsay, from top to bottom, the
Hmm.
intros, song, outros of the skits, and everything just flowed. But there's this record in particular called Sunshine, which you can hear Alice's voice blend in nice, smooth, and through. And then at the end of the record, he says, the sun always shines after the rain, or something to that effect.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Now, it brings to mind my first connection with Jamie Lewis, was when they were assigned to help this group out of Boston, Massachusetts, make their transition from kids to young adult men, knowing Bobby
Hmm.
Brown just got voted out of the group in 85, and then he became a worldwide superstar with Don't Be Cruel. But they added in this baritone singer out of Washington, D.C. by the name of Johnny Gill
Oh,
Hill.
for this
love him.
classic album Heartbreak. And I
Love
don't
him.
know if this ever dawned on Jam and Lewis or anybody associated with them, or if you guys as Jam and Lewis fans. Do you think with them working on Alex provided them a blueprint for how to seamlessly integrate Johnny into New Edition without stepping on Ralph's toes? Knowing
I
that
think,
Ralph was the voice
yeah,
and the look of New Edition.
I think Jay, if you don't mind, I heard a recent interview. I think St. Paul's got a great podcast of his own, Music on the Run, and he talked when the NAM convention and the Music Merchants convention happened recently. Um, Paul had Jam on and talked about the New Edition album. I think he took the stylistics, and I can't remember. It might have been "Bet You by Golly Wow." It was one of the songs where you can hear, in order to introduce the new guy, Johnny Gill, into the band, whoever the equivalent was in the stylistics, they had a replacement baritone singer. They had whoever is the familiar person. They started, if it isn't love was the first single off Heartbreak, right? So people knew, okay, Ralph Tresvant, here's Ralph. Everybody, the people that you know in New Edition. By the time they got to Can You Stand the Rain, his idea was, well, I forget the song.
I
Not
think it's
Bet You
probably
By
You
God. I
Make
think
Me
it was.
Feel Brand New.
That's it. Thank you. That's it. Exactly. Very good. Good on you. And that's how they were able to slowly introduce the new guy, Johnny Gill, into the whole thing. And that's one of my favorite Jam and Lewis songs is Can You Stand the Rain? That song to this day. Um it's just a great it's a great album all around, but what a great way to introduce Johnny Gill to the fans.
And I think that that's a testament to what good producers do, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, you
Yep.
not even just for the ear or for the pleasure of the public, but it's also bringing out what's best in the artist, right? What they're most comfortable with, but then doing it seamlessly where you kind of don't step on somebody, and I think that's
Yep.
exactly. And I love Johnny Gill in New Edition.
Yeah, it definitely made the transition perfect. Now, I don't know if you guys ever saw this documentary that came on the Twin Cities PBS affiliate back in '87 called Minneapolis Sound, where they highlighted different bands in and around Minneapolis. Of course, showed Jam and Lewis, showed them touring the old Flight Time Minneapolis, showed Husker Du, and
Yeah.
then of course they ended up breaking up right as that documentary was going on. And of
Yeah. Bob
course,
Mould was
the
going solo.
Jets, we can't forget how huge the Jets were.
Right.
Let's circle back. Let's talk about the
Crush on You.
Jets for a minute. Crush on You. If you go back and listen to Curiosity, it has erotic city adjacentness all over it.
All over it. Absolutely.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
And then of course you got it all, which was written by Rupert Holmes. Yes, Mr. If You Like Pina Coladas,
Pina
that
Colada
record.
song.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Right.
Rock It To You. I mean, like I said, people sleep on the Jets and how, like I said, they had everybody in the chokehold in the mid to late 80s with their records.
Right, right. And I actually saw a clip of them on YouTube probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they're still putting it down. I mean, the grooves are still there. They're still doing the dance moves. Yes, we're all a little bit older, but that doesn't matter, right? They're still doing their thing.
Right. But to tie back to that Minneapolis Sound doc, while Jam and Lewis was touring the old Flight Time studio showing the camera people around, there was a group in the studio recording an album. This was 87. I want to say maybe fall 87 or so. It was New Edition recording Where They All Started before Heartbreak came out. And for me, I was like, oh, wow. Do you realize you have a rare piece of footage to see New Edition cutting a track for Heartbreak while doing this documentary on the Minneapolis Sound?
That's something.
I'm still stuck on Rupert Holmes writing a song for the Jets. And you brought that up, and I'm like, now I got to go back and listen to it. I'm like, oh my God, that's right.
Yeah, he did write that. And then I think one project that gets overlooked in the Jam and Lewis arsenal that doesn't really get talked about enough is the Crash album that they did for Human League. And of course, Human was a crossover smash, and it really gave them that soul that was missing when, of course, they had Don't You Want Me and all their other synth new wave hits. And I believe there was a story that Philip Oakey was fighting the record because he wasn't used to singing with soul, and much because it's very robotic, very I was working as a waitress
Yeah.
but you gotta have some and I wonder if before recording that record, if Alex or Sherelle probably demoed those records, because you wouldn't tell when you heard Human that, oh, this was the group that put out a new wave record a couple years prior, and Jam and Lewis pretty much turned it on his head and made him, okay, we're gonna give you a little soul, a little sheen.
Excellent question.
Yeah.
I can tell you that the gals that sang in Human League, because Martin Ware, whom I mentioned earlier, who was an original member of that band, and him and Phil were childhood friends. Um, I he had word that the women in the band did not like what Jam and Lewis were trying to do with their vocals, because apparently they took multiple takes to do their vocals, like a lot of
A
takes,
lot.
and they weren't always. This was pre-auto tune, so it took a while to get them to loosen up and do what they wanted to do. But and they didn't like the mix. Their complaint, because they took so long to do the vocal mix. They didn't like the mix, and Phil was stuck like a rock in the hard place. He was kind of caught between them and their management and Jam and Lewis, and he was the go-between guy. And apparently he, something to that effect, that he's like, guys, do what you got to do to make the album sound good. He was the middleman, not by choice. But that I do know about that album. As far as anybody demoing, that's a great question. I personally love that. There's a question to ask Jam and Lewis. Should any one of us ever have the blessed opportunity to ask that question, I'd love to know.
Yeah,
They could.
dying to know
That
too.
song "Human" could have been an Alexander O'Neill song. I could totally hear him sing it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And speaking of Alex and Sherelle, it felt like to me a missed opportunity that Clarence Avant, Jam and Lewis never said, "Hey, why don't we do a duets album with you two like Marvin and Tammy?"
Yeah, sure. Could totally have heard it.
If I can take a moment, Jarrell, and just kind of talk about one thing, and one of the things that I always say is that, you know, how blessed we are to do what we do, right, as content creators, and
Mhm.
you know, there's a reason why everything happens, and I honestly believe that. But
Mhm.
I want to give a shout out. We're talking about a lot of different people, and I think that for me, just being able to talk about some of these artists and to talk about the Minneapolis sound and what they've meant to our lives and to a certain extent our careers, I think is very telling. But for me, the main thing is the relationships that we've been able to form with these people.
Yeah.
You know, I've been fortunate enough to be in the company of Prince and of Morris Day and the Time, Tory Ruffin, Ricky Free Smith, Jelly Bean, who is our blood brother,
Yeah.
Monty Moyer, you know, to be backstage with these people. And I was in Vegas with the original Time, and my wife and I had dinner with the group. And St. Paul Peterson, we had the wonderful Elisa Fiorillo on our show a couple weeks ago, and she was just lovely. And,
Yeah,
and
she
and the
was.
main thing for me is just that, you know, everybody, Hucky Austin and the people that we've talked to, all to a person, have been gracious, have given us their time, have sometimes put up with our nonsense. You
Jay.
know, it's my pleasure, but our responsibility to say thank you, you know, and how good they've been to us. Kurt,
Yeah, I was gonna say you froze there for a second.
okay, how am I now? Cool.
You're
Yeah.
cool. COOL.
Oh,
Now
all the
one
way.
yeah, and one thing that's cool when we think about Control, a lot of people I think don't think of Control as like pre New Jack Swing, but if you listen to Nasty, listen
Hmm.
to the licks, listen to bump bump, it had that same aggressive attitude that you heard that was coming out of what they had, what Full Force was doing with their stuff, Lisa Nicole Jim, UTFO, and then of course later on with Kyle West with I'll Be Sure, and then of course what Teddy Riley did with
Eddie.
Keith Sweat on Make It Last Forever, and then of course Guy's debut album following
Yeah.
year in '88. So do you think Control kind of was sort of gave you a little hint of what was to come if the aggressive attitude that R&B was getting ready to adopt around 85, 86, but really exploded by 87, 88?
Yeah. The whole New Jack Swing thing. I mean, I think how much of a game. I mean, a lot of people cite Control as like the first official New Jack Swing album. Really, it's kind of right there on the cusp. And the way you mentioned Nasty, you mentioned Control, Nasty in particular. That whole Control album. The most Minneapolis thing on that is Pleasure Principle, of course. But that
Right.
to me, that's the most Minneapolis sound thing in the whole album. But um, and I love it for that. But you think about that, and you think about Bobby. We talked about New Edition and Bobby's splitting from the group, and hooks up with Teddy Riley and has this banger of an album, and it is really the birth the baby done been birthed at that point with New Jack Swing,
Right.
Kyle or Keith Sweat, all the guys you just mentioned. I mean, Teddy Riley being the architect of all that, but Jam and Lewis are just as much architects of that whole New Jack Swing sound as well.
Right. And I'm going to piggyback on that because I do agree that, you know, with the Control album and Nasty, it was that almost harder edge, right? I mean, think about it, you
Absolutely.
know, when Bobby came on, okay? If you listen to the way Don't Be Cruel starts, for instance, the song, okay? It's in your face, right? Even My Prerogative, okay? Not only as the statement,
Oh,
but as the musical cadence to it, okay? It's harder edged, it's in your face. So you see that connection and that gap that was bridged from Control into what came after that. So I totally agree.
Right, and listen, and looking at the documentary, The Black Godfather, of course they had L.A. and Babyface talking, and of course Jam and Lewis, and how Jam and Lewis, when L.A. and Face were cutting their teeth, Jam and Lewis opened the door for him to put him in touch with Mr. Clarence Avant, because Jamie Lewis could be like, nah, I ain't gonna do that. Y'all the competition. But it just showed that, like you said earlier point, is enough room for everybody to eat, and how LA and Face, and Jamie Lewis had their own distinct sounds. And, like I mentioned earlier, the deal, when you look at the covers of Street Beat and Material Things, definitely was paying attention to the time and what Jimmy Terry was doing. And then of course, we would be remiss if we didn't mention also in the Solar camp, the Calloway brothers from Midnight Star, and how they were cranking out some stuff too over on Solar for Midnight Star and other acts.
Right.
Reggie and Vincent Calloway.
They did work with Levert at some point as well. I think they worked with Levert at one point.
Yeah. And it's funny because people need to recognize and realize, what came first. And a lot of times, Kurt, and I think you and I had talked about this once in one of our asides before we were on air. Think about Ricky, okay? Think about Freeze and the albums that he played on and the connection he's had to a bunch of songs that people know but don't know it's him, right? But that the Solar catalog, for instance, is legendary, right? Dynasty. Okay, Shalimar, okay, all those groups. And a lot of times people don't realize that
crazy
who was actually on those and the influence that people had on that, right?
He co-wrote Make That Move for Shalimar. So now when I hear it, I go, oh man, that and mentioning And the Beat Goes On by the Whispers and all these other songs, and and ironically, one of his songs, I mean, Dynasty wasn't as huge as the acts just mentioned. But Adventures in the Land of Music, which became the most sampled for hip hop acts, because a lot of these hip hop acts were crate diggers. They would go in these crates in these used record stores, and they'd be looking for stuff that wasn't necessarily like well known to sample off of, so they guess that they wouldn't get sued.
Right.
And using that particular song, which Ricky came up with the chord progression on.
Well, and who did a bunch of that as well? I mean, think about it. Think about Dr. Dre. Okay, think about how Dre created a lot of the legendary beats for NWA and some of the other world-class Wrecking Crew and all that. He was finding those old albums, right? A garage store, somebody's having a garage sale, you find some vinyl, and you turn it into something that's your own. But then people don't realize, hey, who was on those albums? And let's give credit where credit is due, right?
I mean, hiring Roger Troutman for California Love, come on.
Right.
Going old school, bringing those old school influences into the new school.
Right.
And My Prerogative, I mean, those synth bass lines on that's right out of the Gap Band playbook.
Right. Gap Band. Right.
I think of the Gap Band when I hear My Prerogative.
Yeah,
that's just total Gap Band.
And then, of course, the chorus from My Prerogative comes from Remote Control by the Reddings, kids of the late, great Otis Redding. And I want to go with an album cut off of the Control album, You Could Be Mine. Great record. Now, if you listen to the dun, 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 I'm sure Maurice Starr was probably listening to that and said, hey, let's do this for them. Now, backstory. I had a chance to interview Danny Wood from New Kids, and I asked him about the choreography for The Right Stuff. And the choreographer showed them the dance, and their first reaction was, that's Morris Day and the Time Jungle Love. But the choreographer told them, no. This audience has never seen this dance. And once y'all do it, it's going to become your calling card. And guess who the choreographer for The Right Stuff was? And this person I had the chance to interview, former Soul Train dancer, late great Tyrone Proctor.
Wow.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, he did choreography for The Right Stuff for New Kids.
Wow.
Look at you doing your homework there, Mr. Jarrell.
You go ahead. I'm scared.
Seriously, I'm like, okay.
Yes.
And let me give a shout out to the New Kids as well, or NKOTB, whatever. There are still some bad brothers out there putting it down. I see the clips from their shows, and obviously with the affiliation with Love Law, I got to give him a shout out too. His Dorchester brothers. But New Kids still to this day, they're bad.
Yep, and you get to see them up close and personal next year in Vegas.
At the residency, right?
They're doing a residency. Now,
Mhm.
are they doing the mixtape tour as a residency, or is it just NKOTB? Because that mixtape thing, they brought Rick Astley out, who hadn't done live shows in the United States for the longest time,
And Rick is,
Mm,
and they brought him out and a bunch of other folks.
I think the
yeah,
residency is going to be straight dem, I think. But Rick
Them,
Ashley, that's another person who I felt if he would have hooked up with Jam and Lewis, they would have
shit,
crafted something good for him, almost in the vein of
and
George Michael. And Jam and Lewis worked with
oh,
George Michael on the
Monkey,
not the what's the name? The remix for Monkey. And
yeah,
they had
mhm.
said that he was inspired to get with Jam and Lewis to do the remix for Monkey because he heard the cool summer mix for Nasty. It was like,
oh,
hey, do
my
something
favorite
similar for me
version.
for the cool summer mix for Monkey. Some snare.
Yep, yep, yep.
And you got the cool summer mix, man. You've got the bass line that Lewis puts down, man. I mean, that is my favorite version of that song. I like the original version. Nasty's great, but that whole where he's playing the hell out of the bass.
Right.
Oh,
Right. And for
oh,
me, if it is in love, when you go listen to it, gotta listen to it on headphones, you can hear how they structured New Edition's vocals so incredibly well layered, where you can hear Ralph float over the breezy chord, and then you hear that boom, boom at the bottom, and then of course the breakdown in the midsection, tribute to the Jackson Five,
sure.
R.I.P. Tito,
Yep.
and how if you listen to Janet, You Need Me, which was a B-side off of Miss You Much, and the breakdown on that record, very similar to If It Is in Love.
Well, New Edition was an answer to the Jackson Five. I mean, Candy Girl is ABC,
Yeah,
right?
right.
I mean, Mr. Telephone
Yep,
Man,
man. Yep. I was just gonna say.
all that total Jackson Five playbook. But to your point, Jarrell, um, Jam and Lewis was their answer to the Jackson Fives finding the Philadelphia record sound. You know, when they went and hooked up with Gamble and Huff in Philly, not far from where I live, and that was their Jam and Lewis move. And Jam and Lewis gave that Jackson Five influence with a bit more sophistication to your point.
Mm-hmm.
So
And then I think the secret sauce to the Minneapolis sound that nobody really talks about. You know her voice. She put out a solo album. You heard her all over Making Love in the Rain with Herb Alfred, which was later sampled by Bone Thugs and Harmony for Days of Our Lives for the Set It Off soundtrack. I'm talking about Lisa Keith. So can we talk about how an integral part she played in the Minneapolis sound, especially demoing a lot of those records?
I, for me, it's demoing. I think is one way of looking at it, right? But she was actually a part of those songs, right? It
Mhm.
wasn't even just like the demo. So for me, I think it's more becoming a part of the song. Do you
Mhm.
agree?
Yeah. Mhm.
yeah, I'm gonna tell you, I wish I knew more about her than I do. I mean, I know her name, I know she sang a lot of stuff, but
Right, and
is
her
she
name's
still with us?
I think so.
Yeah, I believe she's still with us. I don't know if she's doing music, but yeah, Lisa Keith. And then we mentioned hip
Man,
hop.
get an interview with her, man. See if anybody's gonna do it, Jarrell. That's your beat right there, baby.
So Lisa Keith, if you're listening, if you're watching, come on down. Come on down. We would love to have you. Now we mentioned Prince and hip hop and how it was like not really my scene, but Speech from Arrested Development told a story about how they had sampled Alphabet Street for Tennessee, and it
Tennessee.
became a huge worldwide smash for Arrested Development. And then I guess Prince found out because this was back before you had to go clear, and it was let's hope this record don't become a hit so that we don't have to fork out no money. And instead of him doing a Gilbert O'Sullivan like what he did with Biz Marquee when he did Alone Again Naturally and I Need a Haircut got yanked, I guess he told them like I'll charge you a flat fee for the sample, but not to yank the record off the shelves. And I thought that it was a good move on his part instead of being like, no, you illegally sampled my record, take it off.
Yeah, and wasn't it like 100,000 or something like that?
Yeah, I think it was something
I'm
to
pretty sure.
that degree
I
that it was
remember.
about that much. And then of course, like I said,
That was
Tennessee became a
500,000.
worldwide hit for Arrested Development, and it's still their calling card to this day. And I didn't realize that until a couple years later, till when I listened to Alphabet Street and heard to Tennessee, and then heard Tennessee, like,
Tennessee.
oh, they sample Prince.
It
Yep.
clicks.
Yep.
But,
Oh,
but
I knew it right away. The moment I heard Tennessee, 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 I was like, oh man. I think they paid him 500,000 just for that, just for the one word.
but isn't that very interesting and telling? Because um so he charged him a flat fee and didn't have them yank the record. But then again, when the original seven got back together, they had to change their name to the original seven because Prince wouldn't let them use the name The Time. And it's that type of dichotomy that also fascinates me. Or he wouldn't have let the family still continue to use the moniker The Family. They had to become F Deluxe. So on the one hand, you have a payment and you don't charge the group or have them pull the record, right, for sampling without authorization. But then people that Prince worked with, he would do things that almost to me seem like it would alienate them. I think that the name change to the original seven hurt the sales of Condensate, which is a fantastic CD. Okay, when
Yep.
that came out in 2011, I'm like, wow, the guys are back together. Jesse shredding, it's funky, Toast to the Party Girl, and um, all the songs on there. I think got hurt because they couldn't use the name The Time, and I'm just always hard pressed to find out why Prince did things like that.
He didn't have control, no input.
Yeah, and so he took control is the only way that he could, right? There
Mhm.
you go. You got a
Now,
con.
Yep.
yep.
Yep. I
Now,
mean, it's a great album.
yeah, great album. Now, fast forwarding, we talked about Diamonds and Pearls and MPG, and then going into the latest years with Emancipation, Crystal Ball, when he started to fight with Warner Brothers, scrawling slave across
Mhm.
his face, that he was a champion for artist rights, where he's saying, how are you going to tell me I cannot use my own birth name? You own it, and I don't own none of the stuff that I record. So I'm gonna give my version of the middle finger by scrawling slave across my face and daring you to do something about it. And then when the deal with Warner Brothers was up and he reverted back to using Prince, and how he was an early pioneer in using the internet as a way to get your music out direct to consumer. I believe Emancipation or Crystal Ball was sold on MPG's website,
The ball.
and
Crystal Ball, I remember
Musicology
buying it.
was put into the London newspapers. So he was
Yep.
all about bucking tradition, bucking the system.
Right. And it was innovative, and I know that it also would cause some industry standards because they said when he included musicology in with the price of your ticket on the tour, it obviously counted in SoundScan's counting of albums, and so they had
And they,
to
yeah,
certify it. But then as a result of that, then they changed it.
change it.
He put was it the Planet Earth album and the 2010 album, I think
Yeah.
both ended up
Yeah.
in the Daily Mail, right? In the
Yeah.
Sunday
Daily
Mail
Mail.
in Europe. And so doing things like that bucked the system. Doing things like that, I think, helped, um, right or wrong, seriously hurt the record companies.
Yeah.
And maybe
Yeah.
sometimes some people would say deservedly so, but he was definitely a pioneer in owning what was yours, having control over what was yours, and
Yep.
not letting anybody take advantage of you.
Yeah. And if you backtrack and go back to the origin of why he did the whole slave thing, he'd signed a contract because, and it goes back to Janet. When Janet signed to Virgin Records in the early 90s, she made an $80 million several album deal with Virgin Records.
Mhm.
And Madonna had made a deal with Warner Brothers for 100 million and had her own record label, Maverick Records. Okay. So
Mhm.
when those two female artists got their payday, he's like, "Well, I want a bigger deal than both of them." So he got the $150 million deal for however many albums he was supposed to do. That's almost like a football move, these
Mhm.
three. Um, he had to guarantee them a certain number of records sold, which he
Right.
did not do, because he's the kind of artist that if I go left, everybody else is going left, I'm going to go right. So Diamonds and Pearls does well. He even hires one of Michael Jackson's former personnel, Frank DeLeo,
Leo, right?
and hired one of his former managers, Cavallo Ruffalo and Fargnoli. You listen to help me out, Jay, former head of security for Prince, along with Hucky.
Gilbert Davidson.
Gilbert Davidson. Gilbert Davidson at that time was managing Prince's career, and he had gotten help from Ruffalo. I think it was I think it was Steve Ruffalo or Steve Fargnoli, and hired Frank DeLeo and got them to promote the out of Diamonds and Pearls. Diamonds and Pearls does really well. The Symbol album does not
Right.
do the same numbers. So it's a little more complicated than just him scrawling on his face and all that. Yes, he does pull that move, and he does make a point, and he makes many points on that. But it starts with the fact that he wanted to pull rank among these two female artists who are making more money than he was. And I'm I'm Prince. I want to make more money than you guys, just so he can have his name.
Right.
I mean, it's a lot. There's a little bit of an ego trip in there.
Yeah,
Let's
and
keep
speaking
it a
of
buck.
speaking of ego trip, I'm not soup, shout the troop. That I don't know if you all saw the documentary Greatest Night in Pop about when they
Yes.
recorded We Are the World.
Several
And
times.
about they were trying to get Prince on that record. Of course,
Yep.
Michael and the who's who of who was big at the time was on there, and of course Sheila E was on there, and it kind of felt like watching the doc. You kind of get the sense that it was like, okay, we're gonna have you here as the plant to lure the big fish to come
Yeah.
down. And I think Prince had wanted to put a guitar solo on the record, and
Yeah.
Quincy said no.
No.
Absolutely
Right.
not. And then I think if he would have came, he probably would have wanted a separate recording booth. Definitely not be in the same room with Michael, because of course this was Thriller Mike, zippers on the jacket Mike,
Right.
Michael Jackson
Yep.
getting everybody's mama's jacket out the closet, wearing sparkly, glittery socks. I mean, you probably could cut the tension with the knife if both of them were in the same room that night.
Well, let's not forget.
We're gonna happen, right?
Yeah. Let's not forget. There's this whole story, and Eric Leeds I talked to Eric Leeds off the air about this. The whole James Brown, when James Brown and Prince and Michael Jackson were in the same room, and James is playing live. What's not talked about is Michael basically punked Prince, having him come up there, and Prince embarrasses himself, and then many of his associates will tell you. What's not talked about is Prince got pissed off at Michael and tried to run him over with his car.
Oh, will.i.am told that story too on Drink Champs.
Oh yeah. Oh, that shit's true.
Yeah.
Several other people have confirmed that I've spoken to off the record, and Eric will tell you in a heartbeat, because Eric keeps it not a buck. He keeps it $150.
50, right?
all times, he doesn't care. But so there was tension, and people talk about there wasn't competition. Oh no, there was competition.
Yeah.
I mean, Prince highly respected Michael Jackson, but that night with James Brown, stuff like that, I'm sure he was like, screw this, I'm not. he was a very shy person, and all those people in the room, that's part of it too. But there was a whole other backstory there that I'm sure led to him not recording on that. But let's not forget, he's a control freak. He has no control over this. It's all Quincy and Michael and Lionel Richie's vehicle.
Right.
Prince has no say in the mixing of this stuff, any of it.
Right. So do you think, but with him being so in control, that collaboration with others was hard for him?
Yep. That's why he offered a song.
Right.
For the Tears in Your Eyes. He had control of that.
Right. Recorded it by himself, right? Produced it himself.
With his band and all that for the video. But yeah, he had control of offering a song.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have control of We Are the World.
Right. Right. Because like you said, Kurt, it was Michael and Quincy and Lionel Richie piece, and like the Prince, it had to be in a controlled environment where I can have say so. You got to play by my rules, not the other way
Yeah.
around.
It,
I love that whole documentary is one of the best I've watched in a while. What
it
I
really
love is I think the person who gets the best one-liners in the whole damn documentary is Huey Lewis,
is.
and he's
Yes.
the guy. He's the guy who had to fill in for the lines that Huey Lewis sings were supposed to be Prince. So he's getting these lines, and he said, "Oh, by the way, can you sing a harmony with Cyndi Lauper and Kim Carnes while you're at it? Yeah, go for it. Go, just sing a harmony on top of them, Huey. Go for it. No problem. You can do it. You
And the
know,
way he tells the stories.
I mean, I there's a guy I'd love to talk to just about that. Just about that.
Right. And
I,
with Paisley Park, seeing how it was a sanctuary for Prince and to see
mm,
it being open as a tourist attraction a
mm,
la Graceland for
mm,
Elvis in Memphis.
mm,
I've never been. That's on
mm.
my bucket list to go visit. Now, do you think looking at it from the outside, take the fan out of it, and do you feel in a way it kind of feels where Prince probably wouldn't have wanted Paisley Park to be like a Disneyland where folks make pilgrimages because seeing how, for me, it kind of felt like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, something you always heard, but never really got to see how the chocolate was made.
Or
He did intimate that he did eventually want this to become a museum. I mean, that was clear. Now, is the vision that has been executed currently exactly the way he would want to have done it?
probably not.
He's not here to speak on that. Maybe, probably not exactly the way he wanted. And you speak in Graceland, and I think when he passed, they initially took it over and were running things, and from people who worked there, they were not fans of the folks that from Graceland that were running the show over there.
Kurt and I went. It was
Yeah,
not my first time, not Kurt's first time when we
yeah,
went
I've been twice.
in June. But for me, I will say that it's very tastefully done. Let me take a step back. When you get there, and this is going to sound hokey to some, but there's an energy when you get there.
Yeah.
Okay, and part of it is emotional. Part of it is electric, like the electric vibe. See what I did right there?
Yes, you
Um,
did.
and part of it is just, uh, for lack of a better term, admiration, or for some, I'm sure it's
Mhm.
reverence. But when you get in there, I didn't get the sense that it was Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. What it was very intimate. So
Yeah,
for me, when you walk in and security greets you and everyone's very nice, it's first class from the concierge desk when you first walk in
yeah,
to actually walking into the foyer to where Prince's office is, and the way they do things, the way they show you a video at first, for quite frankly, some of the people who aren't Prince fans or Prince files the way we are,
yeah,
gives you a nice history of his career. It was emotional for me when we were watching it.
yeah,
Um, and then you start to take the tour itself. And when I say it's intimate, it's because it's almost like, because it's not like a voyeuristic thing. It's almost like you're a part of it. We walked into Prince's office, and his office is exactly the same as it was when he passed. His sunglasses are still on the table. There's a notepad on his conference table with his writing on it. His telephone is there. All of his stuff is there, and it's
yeah,
almost like you're there looking into a snapshot of his life, albeit with him almost there.
yeah,
Habibi is in a glass case, you know, where, that beautiful purple guitar, that
yeah,
he obviously played. You walk into the kitchen where the vending machine is, right? And it's just like walking into somebody's home. And then, of course, it's somebody's home with state-of-the-art recording facilities and
yeah,
rehearsal space and everything. But it's an experience that, yeah, it's an you have to experience it to understand it, I think.
yeah.
But I
Uh,
think they did a good job of not making it so much a museum and a tourist attraction, Kurt.
being in the studio itself, the studio control rooms in Studio B, and Studio A and Studio C, but Studio B, where the main stuff happened, and seeing, if you're a recording geek, you see the Publison machine that he used to pitch something. He did Verispeed technique on recorded tape that would speed up and slow down his vocals, but he also had this Publison machine that did the same thing. Apparently, it was a pain in the ass to use. and broke down a lot. But the highlight for the tour for me was getting to hear the 2-track recorder play. They play 2 excerpts. It happened when I went in 2022 and the same 2024. They would play a version, a rough version of Rock and Roll Love Affair.
Mhm.
Okay, that ended up on Hit and Run Part 2. But for me, getting to hear this version of The Breakdown, which would be on Artificial Age, and getting to hear just his a cappella vocals. I mean, I get hairs on my neck. My hairs are standing up just talking about it now. That
Right.
and getting to hear it in the recording studio on the speakers in which he recorded it. Jesus, just that got a lot of people emotional, and it got me again the second time I heard it. And I know Jay, you, and two friends of mine that came along on our trip. We had a pilgrimage of 4 people, 3 of them who've never met, and it was quite special. It
Yeah.
was quite special. Now I can't speak to earlier tours. I've only ever been there in 2022 and 2024 recently, but and getting to see Highway 5 called Prince Rogers Nelson Highway. I did visit outside Paisley Park in 2016, but didn't get to go in. Obviously, it was closed at the time that I visited, paid homage when he passed. But it's smaller than you think.
Yeah.
Like Graceland, a lot of people talk about how Graceland is just a small little mansion. Paisley Park is very intimate. You think it's this great. I mean, yes, there's a big sound stage and all that. It does, Jay. I don't know how you feel about it. It didn't feel overwhelmingly big to me. It did, like you said, intimate.
Right. Right. And I would totally agree with that. It's big enough. And the
Yeah.
way the way they construct the 3-hour tour is fantastic. You know,
Oh,
there's no
you got
waste
to do the ultimate tour,
to do the
and
ultimate.
that's not cheap,
Right.
but
But
that's the tour you need to do.
right.
I'm
And
breaking the
and
bank.
it's just
Yeah, yeah.
do it.
Sell
And
something if you got to sell it. If you're
something,
going to
do
be all the
something.
way out there, you might as well do it all the way.
Right.
Yep, you're gonna do what Casey said in Fiend and take my money, my house, and my car. So
Right.
Yep.
that's definitely one of those things that you have to do. And
Yep.
I believe that there is supposedly a documentary in the works about
Yep.
Prince. It was a 9-hour documentary done by Ezra Eldman, who
Yep.
did the Emmy Award winning OJ Made in America doc. But there was an
Yes.
article that recently came out in the New York Times about how it's in limbo and it may not see the light of day. So it probably may end up being one of those things where you hear about in lore, but will never see the light of day. Now, my personal opinion is when you're doing documentaries like that, I feel you got to tell all sides. You can't have it be a creative fluff piece to promote the positive. If you're going to show the full artist, you got to hold the mirror up and show all sides, good, bad, ugly.
And last night, to your point, Jarrell, to plug another podcast, Mr. Christopher and Jeff Page on Funkatopia. Christopher just did an episode yesterday. In fact, he normally does Tuesday nights. I think they've got an episode right now with an artist.
Yep.
He did an episode. He rarely does a Monday episode, but he talked nothing but about the documentary. I know that there's an article out there floating around that Questlove had watched the entire 9-hour documentary, and talks about how it speaks on black culture, about how black artists always had to have this cloak of, we go back to a call back from earlier in our talk about this cloak of invincibility, and it talks about how black artists had to wear this invincibility to not show vulnerability.
Mhm.
And he said it really hit home for him as a black man to watch this. And he broke down. He called his therapist, and they talked to like 3 in the morning just after he watched this, just about that. He broke down. He cried till he couldn't see. It really hit him that hard. But he said the documentary was not in poor taste. I'm paraphrasing, of course. I'm not speaking for him, and I'm not certainly not saying the exact words that he said. But I mean, he gave a thumbs up. So if it's good enough for Questlove, who's made a documentary of his own called Summer of Soul and is making the Earth, Wind, and Fire
Fire.
documentary in the works, and I understand they're doing the Rick James one as well. I mean, he knows what he knows what the hell he's talking about and what he's doing. If it's good enough for Questlove, it's good enough for me.
Good enough for me, right?
Full stop.
Yep, I agree. And it felt like in the later years when he was doing the piano and microphone hit and run, it kind of felt like he was starting to open up more, let us into his world. And then, of course, when he passed, and then The Beautiful Ones was posthumously released. I got the ebook, I read it. It felt like it was an incomplete work, but it felt like for me, it was like you finally get to peel back the layers of the onion over time that had never been peeled, and you heard it in its own words, speaking about his childhood growing up and how he dealt with the success. And it just made me think as a fan, it would have been a treat if he would have did that a little bit more sooner.
Right.
Brother Jarrell, let me tell you something. Stay at the Courtyard Suites and Inn by Radisson, because that's where he put all his artists that he had, all Shelby J, all them that recorded with him,
And then used to
and
go
Dan Pippenbring.
too.
What's that?
He'd go pick them up sometimes himself.
Yeah, he'd pick them up. He'd pick them up himself, and then give him a tour of here's the Caribou Coffee where I like to get coffee. Here's the, and but Dan Pippenbring, the gentleman who finished that book for Prince, he was supposed to be the co-author on The Beautiful Ones, stayed at the Courtyard.
Yep.
The Country Yard Inn and Suites. And Chanhasen's a cute little town, man. There's a cool little still Midwestern vibe, very suburban. That area's been built up over the years. Obviously, when Prince bought land there, I'm sure he got it for less than a song. I mean, probably dirt cheap. I mean, you talk about a savvy business move, putting it out there in the middle of the only thing around there was a Minnesota Arboretum, where he's done a lot of photo shoots with Steve Park, Herb Ritz, and for other photos for album covers and tour books and what have you. Chanhasen's a lovely town to get to know too. The dinner theater that's there, where the production of Guys and Dolls in 1987 ended up being the backdrop for the Sign of the Times album cover. Having to walk in there, I got to walk into the dinner theater. There was nobody in there. We just kind of snuck in, myself and a friend. Jay, you weren't part of that, but we got to sneak into the dinner theater. There's a whole cool vibe, that you got to explore. And I have some tour itineraries, so when you go out there, let me know, and I'll give you all the places to go and places to see. And there's resources out there, obviously. I'm sure you've done your homework too, but
yeah, for sure.
Things that are not on everybody's radar, like St. Anne's Park, Riley Creek Park. Yeah, there's a whole laundry list of places to visit, not just Paisley Park, but it's great.
Right, and I saw that, I believe Airbnb put up where you can actually stay at the Purple Rain house
on Snelling Ave.
Yeah.
I saw it before Airbnb took over that whole thing. I guess it's part of the estate. I know Wendy and Lisa are involved in that somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know how much it is, to be honest with you. I'm sure it's not cheap. It ain't $99 a night, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a vetting process where it's going to be like a fan experience. I wonder if you ring the doorbell, it says, "Answer me." When you ring the doorbell.
You keep this house clean. Do not keep the heat on.
Dad, she's heard you. Liar. He's trying to kill me. Dad, please. But I
want to get her on. Speaking of side note, she's still with us. If you watch the Christmas specials, Olga Katsouris, is that her name? Olga?
Carlatos.
Carlatos. Thank you. Mm-hmm. She is the wife of one of the guys who put together Rankin and Bass, the holiday specials. The stop time animation, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and all that.
Oh.
She's married to, I believe she's married. I think he passed away, but she was married to one of the guys, and she lives in I think Kingston, Jamaica, or wherever the hell she lives. I'd love to get her on.
Yeah, definitely that. Now
she's still with us.
Yeah, she is still with us.
She's Greek.
Greek, yes. And speaking of Greek connection, Greek freak Giannis Antetokounmpo, Prince was a big b-ball fan, as we saw in the yearbook, where he actually played for his school team, and of course, in infamy, the infamous Chappelle skit with him
Yep.
playing basketball in his Prince and the Revolution get up. But a lot of people said Prince was actually a baller. It could
They say he
cross
could
you up
ball.
Point
too.
guard. He was a
Yep.
point guard, I think, right, for Bryant Junior High.
And I've obviously the
Yep.
Chappelle story has been well
Oh
documented
man.
and retold. But I was watching an interview with KG, Kevin Garnett, and
Mhm.
he reaffirmed everything. He talked about having been out at Paisley Park and had the opportunity to ball with Prince and play basketball, and he said it's legit. You know, he
Lucky Austin, his former bodyguard, will tell you the same story. He's been to many a match with. In fact, I think he was on the Blouses team, if I'm not mistaken.
and shameless plug, our interview with Hucky Austin was just posted today on the Electric Vibe podcast.
That's
Please
correct.
tune
Good
in and
job, Jay. Good job.
Always be plugging, always be promoting. But I'm just imagining you coming down, Prince dribbling the ball, pulling up like Curry for three, and then give you that stare in the eye. And you try not to look into the eye, because if you do, it's like in Indiana Jones Temple of Doom, you'll turn into stone.
right, hypnotized.
Ah,
which is
yeah.
which is which is crazy. And to tie this thing up with a bow, you mentioned several times in the podcast the Electric Vibe. You guys interview people in and around the Minneapolis
Yes,
Sound.
sir.
So tell
Yes, sir.
people about where we can hear the podcast. You mentioned the upcoming guests that you have on the podcast, and tell us how it came to be and how you guys hooked up to have this great platform.
I'd love to give Jay the honor of starting us off.
Thank you. I always say, Jarrell, that the power of social media is palpable. Okay, and let's face it, a lot of times it's not used for necessarily good things. Okay,
Mm,
and it does get it sometimes gets a bad rap, deservedly so. But by the same token, the power of social media and the connections that you can make through social media are life changing. And that's exactly what happened for me. And I'm going to hopefully speak for Kurt as well.
absolutely.
Kurt and I had never met. We got to know each other through social media. I would see Kurt's posts. He'd talk about Prince or he'd talk about other things, or he's very sharp dressed. So I would, comment on his post, brother, you're looking dap today. I sent him a friend request. He accepted. And we would just kind of communicate that way. We had,
Yeah.
mentioned in each other's posts, but we had never actually spoken. But we had that connection. We had that vibe. So I answered a post on a Sunday night um, in like April, I think it was March or April.
Something like
And
that. Yeah.
all of a sudden it's like 8:30 at night. And my phone, I get a Facebook message call and it says Kurt Hoffman. I says, well, I'm going to pick this up. And I picked it up. We probably talked for an hour,
Yeah. About
just,
that.
getting to know each other. But the conversation was very organic, right? It
Yep.
just flowed. It seemed like we had known each other forever. And so in the talks, I know that Kurt had the Purple Kurt podcast, and he was podcasting and doing videos and stories and things like that. And I think that you asked me to join you. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
For the longest time, Jarrell, I had thought of just dissolving my Purple Kurt podcast on YouTube, of which those episodes are still up on the Electric Vibe. Somehow we're going to format that differently, Jay, but we'll talk about that. That's a business. That's a business talk for another day.
And I'm not too far
But
gone to see that yet.
and you ain't too far gone to see that. So yeah, we're gonna keep the Prince references going. But long of the short of it, Jarrell, is that I was done just hosting it myself, and I wanted to broaden it to, we do talk to a lot of Prince associates and stuff like that, but I wanted to broaden it more and not be Purple Kurt necessarily anymore. Though my heart still bleeds purple, I wanted it to be more of a broad thing. So Jay and I joined forces, and I was going through different names, and you'll see the incarnations there on the YouTube page. But I said, Jay, Jay mentions the vibe, and I said there is a vibe between the two of us. It's an electric vibe, and I said I thought about what the hell it calls. In the middle of the night, it hit me, the electric vibe. For whatever reason, it encapsulated what Jay means to me and what working with the two of us together is there's an electric vibe every time we're on virtual and the one time that we were in person together for a couple days. there's this natural vibe. There's a hum of electricity when the two of us work together, and I thought that was a very fitting name for what we do. But we definitely want to and have talked to people who are not in the Prince universe. And our goal and our mission is to talk to people who are involved in fashion, executive protection, like Hucky Austin, our recent guest was. But we have other
Educate.
people on the horizons, political figures, activists that will have forthcoming in future episodes.
And
Okay.
right now, you can catch us on YouTube, but very shortly,
Yes.
probably within the next week to week and a half, we are going to be on all major platforms. So we are right now with a partner who's going to help us host our podcast, and we'll be on Apple Podcast, we'll be on Amazon, we'll be on Spotify. Our new logo is being created, new theme song. So you're going to see a
Yes.
lot of exciting changes coming up with the Electric Vibe. But the one thing that we are still very, very committed to is talking to people outside the purple circle, talking to people inside the purple circle, but always making sure that the people that we talk to have a voice. And our podcast is always going to be a safe space. We are going to promote and talk to individuals as individuals. Yes, they may have worked with Prince. That's not how we lead, though. We don't use the Prince connection to get any of our connections. We are very, very committed to helping people promote their product and their brand. And sure, we're going to talk about Prince. We're going to talk about that association,
Absolutely.
but
Yeah.
that's not going to be our main focus. And I think that's
Mhm.
held us in pretty good stead during the short time that we've been doing this. So we're just trying to make a difference, a
Yeah.
small difference
Yeah.
in this
Yeah.
thing that we do.
Yeah, you guys are doing your thing with the podcast. I love the content. Hopefully, I could be a guest on there in the future if you guys would have me so that we can all dance to the electric vibes. You see what I did there? Dance
I did.
electric. Shout out to Andre Simone.
Andre Simone, right?
Jarrell, tag, you're it.
Right. Right.
Tag,
So
you're it.
definitely
We'd be glad to have you on. And perhaps if we have a guest, Jay, and I'm sure you'd be all right with this. If there's a particular person, the person you mentioned, we'll talk off the air about. I was doing a little research while we were talking. Maybe we can all join forces and co-host an episode on a person as well.
Come
I would love
together
that.
like Voltron, or as my generation would say, Power Ranger Megazord. Join forces. And
Hey,
do you guys have any
Avengers
shout outs?
Assemble.
Avengers Assemble, yes. So you guys have any shout outs you want to give before we wrap?
I want to thank my husband upstairs for putting up with me not being downstairs. But I did cook. I made sure I cooked dinner tonight before I came down here.
and for me, it's going to be to my queen Robin and my family, who have been very supportive in this initiative, because it's not easy. It takes time, it takes money, and I'm grateful for the love and support. And I have to give a shout out to my co-host Kurt. He has become a brother to me, and I'm not just saying that. We formed this connection and this vibe, and what we're doing together and have been doing together it's literally in a short amount of time has changed my life. So
Feelings mutual. I love you, bro.
All
love you back.
right. Yeah, and you can catch this podcast wherever you stream podcasts on all major platforms and on YouTube at youtube.com/beyond the album cover. And I just want to say thank you for everybody that's ever listened to an interview, whether it be from my origins at the Time Machine at WAG, started 20 years ago, to Beyond the Album Cover. For everybody that I've ever interviewed over the years, big or small, thank you, thank you, thank you. Who would have thought that this little boy from Gaston, North Carolina, would be interviewing all these people and interviewing Kurt and Jay of the Electric Vibe podcast? Thank you guys for coming on, and you're definitely more than welcome to come back on again. And I just got to say this one real quick before we wrap. You ain't know we was coming back like this on them, my brother.